There is a town in northern Manitoba sitting on the edge of Hudson Bay. It has a population of roughly 900 people. It is so remote that you cannot drive to it. The only ways in are by rail or by air. For most of the 20th century, it shipped grain for a few weeks in the summer and then went quiet. But in the spring of 2026, that town, Churchill, became the center of one of the most ambitious infrastructure conversations in Canadian history. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew committed to a plan to transform Churchill into a strategic Arctic LNG export hub, with a target of getting liquefied natural gas flowing to European markets by 2030. And the federal government made something very clear. Ottawa set a firm 2030 deadline with a warning that funding for the port's expansion could be withdrawn if the target is missed. To understand why this moment matters, why a tiny subarctic port is suddenly at the center of Canadian energy strategy, geopolitics, Indigenous ownership, Arctic sovereignty, and a European energy crisis, you have to understand the layers of pressure that have converged at exactly this point in time. Let's start with Europe, because that is where the demand signal originates. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the continent's assumption of cheap pipeline gas from the east, European nations embarked on a frantic search for alternative LNG suppliers. The numbers tell that story clearly. Europe ramped up LNG imports by 25% in the first half of 2025, working to offset reductions in pipeline gas from Russia and Norway. That is not a small fluctuation. That is a structural shift in how an entire continent thinks about energy security. And Canada, sitting on some of the world's largest natural gas reserves, has been watching that shift with enormous interest. But there is a second geopolitical layer here that is specifically Canadian. The trade war with the United States under the Trump administration sent shockwaves through Ottawa. Decades of comfortable north-south economic integration, the assumption that Canada would always send its resources south and let American markets do the work, suddenly looked fragile. The ongoing trade dispute with the United States and growing calls to find new ways to ship energy from Western Canada renewed interest in Churchill. In a matter of months, the political calculus in Ottawa changed fundamentally. Canada needed new export corridors. It needed them urgently, and it needed them that did not run through American territory. This shift aligned with Ottawa's goals of diversifying trade routes, strengthening Arctic sovereignty, and reducing reliance on the United States. When you understand that triple motive, trade diversification, Arctic sovereignty, and American decoupling, the Churchill LNG project stops looking like a regional infrastructure story and starts looking like a piece of serious national strategy. Now, the term being used in federal planning documents is Churchill Plus. That phrase is doing a lot of work and deserves unpacking. Proposals for the Port of Churchill Plus have envisioned a resource corridor that would transport LNG, potash, oil, mineral ores, fertilizer, and other agricultural products from Western Canada to Hudson Bay for delivery to international markets. That requires upgrades to the Northern Railway system, an all-season road, all-season shipping routes, and a fossil fuel pipeline. So when people talk about Churchill LNG, they are not talking about one project. They are talking about a web of interlocking infrastructure, a pipeline running from Alberta's gas fields through Manitoba's north, an LNG liquefaction terminal on Hudson Bay, an upgraded railway system, an all-season road, and ultimately, ice-capable tankers sailing from Hudson Bay northeast through Arctic waters and then into European ports. Federal plans under the Churchill Plus concept envision an integrated corridor with rail, marine, and energy infrastructure alongside icebreaking capacity. That last element, icebreaking capacity, is not a small logistical footnote. It is one of the central technical questions that will determine whether any of this is physically feasible by 2030. Supporters of the Churchill route make a compelling geographic case. Federal material describes Churchill as the prairie's only tidewater access and the shortest route from the prairie provinces to European markets. That is a significant advantage. Most of Canada's existing LNG development has been Pacific-facing, centered in British Columbia and pointed toward Asia. Canada's existing LNG build-out has been heavily Pacific-facing, centered in British Columbia. A Hudson Bay corridor would open an entirely different vector, one aimed directly at the Atlantic, at Europe, at the markets most desperate for diversified gas supplies. And the commercial interest is real. Arctic Gateway recently signed an agreement with Port of Antwerp Bruges International to explore long-term trade development, and the company explicitly says Europe's search for reliable supplies of energy and critical raw materials creates an opening for Churchill. The Port of Antwerp Bruges is one of the largest port complexes in the world. That is not a symbolic agreement. That is a serious commercial conversation. Barry Prentice, professor of supply chain management at the University of Manitoba, says threats to Canada's Arctic sovereignty and tariffs from its largest trade partner have stirred up the pot a bit. At the same time, new technologies and the realities of a rapidly changing northern climate have created opportunities to improve the economics of an Arctic trade route. The stars are kind of aligning so that Churchill again becomes a viable and maybe very attractive route, Prentice says. Here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because the pipeline and the spine of this entire project does not yet exist. It has not been approved, it has not been designed for construction, and the engineering challenges it faces are formidable. Any pipeline from Alberta's oil fields to Manitoba's northern coast would need to cross the Canadian Shield, the tundra, and permafrost. These ecosystems are changing rapidly as the planet warms. More than half of existing infrastructure in the Arctic is projected to incur damages by mid-century as a result of climate change. That last point carries a painful irony. The very climate change that is melting Arctic sea ice, making northern shipping routes more viable, is also destabilizing the permafrost that any pipeline would have to traverse. The ground is literally shifting beneath the project. Manitoba has already lived this problem firsthand. The Hudson Bay Railway, which runs more than 800 kilometers between the Pas and Churchill, was among the first major transportation projects built over Canadian permafrost. Since its construction in the late 1920s, it has required regular maintenance as the weight and heat of train traffic thaws the ice-rich permafrost over which it was built. The railway was out of service for 18 months after being washed out by floods in 2017. Federal and provincial governments have spent upwards of $500 million to purchase, repair, maintain, and upgrade the railway since 2018. That railway is the cautionary tale. It is also the only existing land connection to Churchill. And it illustrates exactly what awaits any pipeline developer who tries to run infrastructure across northern Manitoba's shifting, thawing ground. Christopher Dolman, an Alberta-based LNG specialist for the U.S. Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, offered a frank assessment. While nothing is impossible, the 2030 target appears tough to achieve. Typically, pipeline permits take 5 years for approval, with another 5 years or so needed for construction. A Hudson Bay pipeline would need to account for permafrost concerns, meaning it would likely be constructed above ground. When you add those timelines together, you are already at a decade. And the 2030 target is less than 4 years away. 2 companies have come forward with specific pipeline proposals, and their stories reveal the complexity beneath the political ambition. Nista Nan, a Manitoba and Alberta-based company with First Nations owners, has proposed a utility corridor to Port Nelson, Manitoba, a site 300 kilometers southeast of Churchill, that would be capable of exporting liquefied natural gas. The company's website says it has secured support from 2 Canadian natural gas producers and is exploring the feasibility of exporting LNG via a facility at the mouth of the Nelson River. Port Nelson is itself a fascinating historical footnote. From 1912 to 1918, the federal government attempted to build a deepwater port along the north side of the Nelson River, but was thwarted by labor shortages during the First World War, the extreme climate on the coast of Hudson Bay, and heavy silting along the fast-flowing river. Over a century later, a new generation is attempting to revive that vision, this time with Indigenous ownership at the center. The port and corridor will be 100% Indigenous owned, said Robin Lohr, a Nista Nan director based in Calgary. That framing matters enormously in the current political environment. Projects with genuine indigenous equity ownership have a measurably different regulatory and social dynamic than those imposed on communities from outside. The second proponent, Western Energy Corridor, has taken a different approach. The Alberta-based organization proposes developing a link between Churchill and Western Canada that could contain one or more combinations of a natural gas transmission system, an oil pipeline, or a high-voltage electric transmission system. The company's website states it has mapped out a 1,560-kilometer corridor and drafted documents for initial regulatory filing. Neither of these proposals has been approved. Neither has broken ground. And the regulatory process for pipelines in Canada, even with Ottawa's pledged fast-tracking, remains one of the most complex in the world. Even if a pipeline were built, the LNG still has to get from Hudson Bay to Europe. And that means navigating one of the world's most challenging maritime environments. Churchill's shipping season historically runs for only a few months in summer. To make it viable as an LNG hub, Canada needs year-round shipping capability. The University of Manitoba and the Arctic Research Foundation say they are entering a crucial phase of a study to establish the feasibility of turning Churchill into a year-round maritime hub. That study's final report is not due until February 2027, nearly a year after the 2030 commercial target was announced. The science and the political ambition are operating on very different timetables. Natural gas vessels were unheard of in Arctic waters in 2014, but as of 2025, there were 40 unique gas tankers in the north sailing more than 866,000 nautical miles combined. But just because the bay is ice-free doesn't mean it's navigable, warns Fei-Yue Wang, director of the Churchill Marine Observatory. Wang has raised environmental concerns as well. He worries about the risk of oil spills as shipping traffic increases. We need to develop technologies that can help us respond better in the event of a tanker spill and other concerns, he said. And these technologies will need to address the very specific problems of Arctic waters, especially if we want to do this project not only early, but also do it right. Hudson Bay is not a benign environment. It is home to polar bear populations, beluga whale habitat, migratory bird routes, and some of the most ecologically sensitive waters on the planet. The risk calculus is real, and it is not going away simply because a political deadline has been set. Ottawa has put money on the table. The $280 million in joint funding will support planning, design, and pre-development work, with the project framed as a fast-track infrastructure priority. Manitoba's 2026 provincial budget contributed an additional $10 million to keep building the momentum on this project and attract even more private sector interest in a potential energy corridor. But $290 million, when you add those figures together, is planning money, not construction money. The actual infrastructure costs for a 1,500-kilometer pipeline across permafrost, a world-class LNG liquefaction facility, port upgrades, ice-breaking vessels, and an all-weather road would run into the tens of billions of dollars. The private sector will have to carry the overwhelming majority of that load, and private investors make decisions based on returns, not political timelines. Arctic Gateway Group, a partnership of 41 northern communities and First Nations that operates the port and the railway that serves it, has been conducting feasibility studies with the province and federal government to gather industry perspectives about the possible export hub and energy corridor. That structure, 41 communities, First Nations ownership, public-private partnership, is the model Ottawa is betting on. But it is a model that has never been tested at this scale in the Canadian North. There is a tension at the heart of this project that no amount of political enthusiasm can dissolve. By the time Churchill's LNG infrastructure is operational, Europe may no longer need Canadian fossil gas, risking stranded assets, massive debts, and a gas-to-nowhere scenario. Europe has set aggressive green energy targets. Germany, France, the Netherlands, the major potential customers for Churchill LNG, are simultaneously pursuing offshore wind, hydrogen, solar, and energy efficiency at a pace that was unimaginable a decade ago. The question of whether European demand for LNG will remain high enough in the 2030s and 2040s to justify the cost of Canada's Arctic infrastructure is genuinely contested among energy economists. Positioned as the leading export to justify Churchill's expansion, LNG is almost entirely methane, a greenhouse gas 82 times more potent than CO2 over 20 years. Canada's LNG is no cleaner than other sources of LNG globally, and in some cases, even worse. That is not an argument against the project on its own, but it is an argument that the project must be situated within a credible long-term climate framework, and that framework remains largely unspecified in the current political rhetoric. Premier Kinyu himself has been more candid than most politicians tend to be. "I will fully acknowledge that 2030 is very, very aggressive," he said. That is a rare admission in political infrastructure announcements, and it reveals something important. The 2030 target is functioning as a mobilizing tool, not a guaranteed delivery date. The political framing of the 2030 date suggests it is as much a catalyst for action as a firm completion guarantee. That does not make the project less serious. It makes it more honest. Kinyu has acknowledged that pulling this off within 4 years requires immediate construction, private investment, indigenous partnership, regulatory fast-tracking, and environmental approval simultaneously. Being challenged with a specific timeline gives us the opportunity to pull people together and say, hey, if we want to do this in 3.5 years, we're going to need to work together and we're going to need to roll up our sleeves and just sort through these issues, he said. To deliver LNG from Churchill to European markets by 2030, the following would all have to happen within roughly the next 18 months. Regulatory approvals for a pipeline route that doesn't yet exist, a final investment decision from private capital, indigenous consent and equity participation across dozens of First Nations communities along the corridor, the beginning of above-ground pipeline construction across permafrost, the commissioning of an LNG liquefaction terminal, the procurement of ice-capable tankers, and the conclusion of year-round shipping feasibility studies that are not expected to report until February 2027. Kinyu says the resource corridor he envisions could include a pipeline, a transmission line, an all-weather road, and an LNG terminal. But he cautions that's just one potential avenue. That hedge is significant. Even the project's champion is not claiming to know exactly what shape the final infrastructure will take. Prentice, the supply chain professor, says the challenges of permafrost pipelines are not insurmountable. They built an oil pipeline across Alaska above ground and it still functions, he says. I don't think it's something that the pipeline industry is incapable of doing again. It's just a matter of the costs and whether you have an investor willing to do it. That last phrase, whether you have an investor willing to do it, is where the project either succeeds or stalls. Government can plan. Government can fund feasibility studies. Government can offer regulatory fast tracks, but only private capital can actually build a 1,500-kilometer Arctic pipeline. And private capital answers to returns, not ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Step back from the engineering and the politics, and what you see is something genuinely historic in its ambition. Canada is attempting to reorient its entire energy export geography, away from an increasingly unreliable southern neighbor and toward the Arctic Ocean and European markets, in under 4 years. It is simultaneously trying to do this in a way that centers Indigenous ownership, respects environmental limits, and positions Canada as a reliable supplier to a continent that desperately needs one. A northern port once seen as a niche seasonal asset is now being talked about as part of a much bigger national strategy. Ottawa and Manitoba are accelerating work around Churchill, where rail, marine, and energy infrastructure could eventually form a new export corridor on Hudson Bay. The idea reaches far beyond one commodity. It touches trade diversification, Arctic sovereignty, Indigenous economic leadership, and the search for new routes to global markets. Whether Churchill delivers LNG to Europe by 2030 is genuinely uncertain. The technical obstacles are real. The regulatory timeline is compressed, the environmental questions are unresolved, and the financing remains to be secured. But the strategic logic is sound. The geopolitical moment is real. The European demand signal is undeniable. And Canada, for the first time in a long time, is seriously asking whether its north can become something more than a symbol of sovereignty and a habitat for wildlife, whether it can become infrastructure, whether it can become a corridor, whether it can become, in the words of Arctic Gateway's CEO, the place where Canada has what the world needs and the will to deliver it. The answer to that question will define the next decade of Canadian energy policy. And Churchill, population 900, sitting on the frozen edge of Hudson Bay, is where the answer begins.